Whenever you'd like to start.
Okay, Dr. Mignolo, thank you very much for visiting us at UC Merced. We had a very good discussion yesterday at your talk, and we would like to continue with a brief interview. And the idea is to touch on several of the key terms that you use in your theory, so that this interview could be used as an introduction for our graduate courses on the decolonial project. And the first question I have, yesterday after your talk, you mentioned that you're not entirely comfortable with the concept of decolonial studies, that it is okay to say post-colonial studies, but you prefer other terms such as the colonial project because it goes beyond the scholarly and academic. It's a real project with a realistic component. So I would like you to elaborate on that, and also if you could let us know if you think there are differences between your own approach and that of, for example, Aníbal Quijano, Enrique Dussel, or other thinkers of this group.
Well, thank you for the invitation first. I have also very, very good time and very good discussion, very good conversation. So thank you for having me here. So the first question, yes, studies. Well, think about the question of first the discipline, sociology, economy, etc. They don't have the study. So when the concept of a study comes, the concept of study comes when field of investigation emerged basically after the civil rights movement. So we have women's studies and ethnic studies, Afro-American studies, and then post-colonial studies, cultural studies, and that's fine. I think it was very important that this kind of movement and way of thinking emerged in the academia because they broke up the control of the discipline. And what is important there in this kind of emergence is that research investigation was taken up by people fighting for their own liberation, women, Afro, gay and lesbian, etc., etc. So post-colonial studies enter into that kind of configuration. But I don't see decolonial studies, anybody talking about decolonial studies, or at least I don't talk about any of the people, colleagues, friends I work with, because we see this as a decolonial thinking, decolonial way of being in the world. You do investigation, but you do investigation not to study something, but to kind of advance advocacy for decolonization, and decolonization is a form of liberation that we can talk more about that. So that is why study is not something that I never talked about decolonial studies. And again, if you read Dussel is a philosopher. So you don't talk about philosophical studies, you talk about philosophy. Right? Quijano is a sociologist. You don't talk about sociological studies. You talk about sociology, and that's the way a third world sociologist works, right? So it's not within the frame of first world sociology. I remember Renato Ortiz, a Brazilian, who is a sociologist, and he says, because I am a Brazilian sociologist, people think that I am doing cultural studies. Because you are not the kind of orthodox, you don't follow the rule, you are disobedient.
The Eurocentric.
Yeah, right, exactly. You just think you have. So what happened there with Renato Ortiz or Quijano is that they are part of Latin American social thought, in the way that there is no studies in the 18th century, but what Rousseau and all these people were doing was social thought, not even social theory, if you will. So that we want to delink from disciplines and also from this kind of new formation kind of studies. Because the question of studies keep the distinction between the object and the known and the knower. So that's another big discussion there. But that's some of the reason I insist that this is a way of thinking, it's a project, it's a collective project, etc. So the second question, we don't see it in a kind of that, if there is no colonial study, there is no sense of talking about different approaches to colonial studies because the colonial study doesn't exist.
Oh, okay. That's a good point. That's a good point.
Right. So what we have, I mean, let me put it in this way. The decolonial project emerged after a lot of people in different parts of the world, in Latin America here, were reading Quijano, but we were reading Quijano without knowing each other. Until in '98, Edgardo Lander organized 2 panels of the International Sociological Organization in Montreal. And he invited Quijano, he invited Coronel, Escobar, myself. And Quijano was there, of course. And that was kind of the beginning. So a lot of people began to kind of work and talk and get together around the concept of coloniality. Mm-hmm. And then we introduced, or we approached, we have brought also the concept of transmodernity. Mm-hmm. Why? And there was a difference, interesting difference there, because Quijano was talking at that point still about socialism as a kind of outcome. But Dussel was talking about transmodernity. So we have several good discussions between Dussel and Quijano, but that was kind of not difference, but kind of forming a community, a kind of intellectual and political community, right? Mm-hmm. So between '98 and 2005-06, there was a lot of, almost every year was a meeting of the collective. But then, well, that the collective was formed. So it was, and then other people came, like Maria Lugones and Catherine Walsh, Santiago Castro Gomez, etc. So, and then after 2006, it's like kind of we do things, but according to the situation, the position we are. For example, Dussel organized things in Mexico, Quijano organized things in Peru. I organize. There is an emergence of new people in Europe, for example, who do art, curator artists, etc. So all of that is not different approaches to something that doesn't exist, but different contribution to a project in which a lot of people are coming together. So Dussel is philosopher, Castro Gomez philosopher, Quijano is sociologist, Catherine Walsh comes from pedagogy. She worked with Paulo Freire. Nelson is philosophy and religion. Maria Lugones introduced the whole kind of discussion of decolonial feminism, etc., etc. So that is, and that's why I published in 2011 a kind of annotated bibliography of the project, and now I am updating it. So now what you see is different kind of event or publication where not all of us are there, but they're kind of different. But we have a common root that is the concept of coloniality. The idea that there is no modernity without coloniality, that is a kind of connect all of us. All of us accept the concept of transmodernity as something that we have to move toward the future.
So you would think that perhaps one of the main differences between postcolonial studies and the decolonial project is that the decolonial project has a component of activism that is not necessarily present in postcolonial studies, that is more scholarly, academic within the university, or?
Yeah, I think so, because what we call postcolonial studies or postcolonialism at large, and we can include there subaltern studies. Was born as a kind of academic. Guha was in England at that Essex at that time, and then Baba and Spivak in the United States. So it's an academic, and that kind of postcolonialism entered into this new configuration of field of studies, right? But the concept of coloniality is a concept that emerged not in the academia, emerged in the kind of field in which dependency theory, theology of liberation, philosophy of liberation are coming. So the concept of coloniality in the 90s entered into this way of social thought in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And it is in the university, but it's also outside of the university. So there is a lot of other organizations who are kind of taking the concept that also we attend, we are invited to this kind of workshop in which there are social movement, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Catherine Walsh is doing a terrific job in Ecuador, and she has been doing that for a long time with Afro communities and indigenous communities. And it's not that she's a kind of the avant-garde intellectual who tell them what to do. No, they know what they want to do, but they need also the collaboration, and we need them too, because that's what we are doing. I mean, a lot of our thinking comes from the thinking of people outside of the university.
Mm-hmm. So now that you make the connection between the decolonial project and dependency theory and liberation theology, I have a couple of questions about both liberation theology and dependency theory. For example, with liberation theology, since Leonardo Boff, Gustavo Gutiérrez, Clovis Boff, all these thinkers were Catholic priests, and Catholicism, just like Islam, are, in my view, universalist projects, right? There's a universalism there. Don't you see a contradiction? Because the decolonial project, one of the things that as I understand it, that tries to combat or avoid is that very universalism, where the European thought of 5 countries is imposed on the rest of the world and homogenizes the university, right? And I think it's Enrique Dussel that proposes pluriversality, right? A world where several worlds
well, but that's not Dussel.
It's you.
That's Hinkelammer, and that's after Hinkelammer is me and Dussel, but it's coming from Hinkelammer.
So is there a contradiction, for example, when we talk, there's works, for example, of decolonial studies and Islam, or there's this connection between liberation theology and decolonial studies?
There's no decolonial studies.
I mean, sorry, the project. So is there a contradiction between universalist projects such as Islam and Christianity and the decolonial project, or not?
Well, there's very complexity here. Number one, we have to distinguish theology from theology of liberation. Mm-hmm. Christian theology is obviously a universal project, right? Mm-hmm. That was from this, and then we kind of share with the secularists, but it is. And so is what Islam. But theology, on the one hand, so theology of liberation is not the same that Christian theology.
But it's part of it. But it's part of it.
It's part of it. And there is two distinctions to be made here. Liberation theology is a third world creation, while Christian theology, well, was Constantine, but then we kind of institutionalized in the papacy. And that is why Gutierrez has to renounce to theology of liberation, because I don't remember which pope said, well, either or. You stay with the church.
John Paul II.
Huh?
John Paul II.
John Paul II. Okay, so that is. So in that sense, I think that third world theory of liberation in Latin America was, I won't say that this is decolonial, but there was a kind of an important kind of fracture with the church, and that is why a lot of in Nicaragua, in Salvador was a kind of right, and then you see Ruiz, all what Ruiz did in Chiapas with the Zapatistas. So I think that the third world theory of liberation is very important ally of decolonial thought and decolonial doing and decolonial thinking. It's not the same, but I think it's. But then there is another dimension. Because Native American theology, for example, they talk about the other third world. And so George Tinker, for example, one of the prominent Native American theologians, he made very clear the distinction between theology of liberation in Latin America and the third world and theology. Why? because the question is that in Latin American theologian and liberation of European descent, this was not a project of
exactly.
Afro, but was not Afro or indigenous, but here it's indigenous. So, and then we have kind of Jewish theology of liberation. Well, I cannot remember the name now. Mark Ellis here in the United States had a lot of problem at the university, some University of Texas, because Jewish theology of liberation is working with Palestinians. Mm-hmm. So I think this is very important for me, for example. I mean, it's very important to work with people knowing the difference between black theory of theology of liberation in the United States also, Native American theology of liberation, Third World theory of liberation, and all of these are confronted with the Christian theology, the kind of institutional. Mm-hmm. Because they are not studied, they are projects. Mm-hmm. You see, you don't talk about theology of liberation studies or native theology. No. It's a way of thinking and a way of doing and a way of advocating. You do research, but you do research for advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And so the other part of the question I haven't asked it yet. So the connection between dependency theory. So my question is, even Frantz Fanon, no, in Les Damnés de la Terre, mentioned many times that the wealth of Europe is because of the exploitation of the Third World and its colonies, and there's a connection there. And you don't have an imperial wealthy Europe if you hadn't had the exploitation before that. So how do you explain, for example, the two things in my view, right? Colonized countries like the Asian tigers, right? Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea. These countries were also colonized many times, by Korea by everybody, right? By the Japanese, by the Chinese, the Russians have tried. How do you explain that they have overcome the coloniality they suffered after becoming independent in order to become a very strong capitalist society that competes with the West economically and now in other terms, as you mentioned yesterday at the talk? And the second part of the question is, did in your view, when dependency theory was in vogue, right? It was a main topic in Latin America, and this was in all the discussions. How did they explain the dependency that you have within the countries? Because there's a center and a periphery in Mexico, right? It's not the same to be in Mexico City than to be in Guerrero, Chiapas, or Oaxaca, no? And the same in Peru. Being in Lima and being in Puno is not the same at all. So those are my two questions.
Well, there's a lot of things there. But let me start for the more kind of provocative answer. I think we misunderstood in Latin American dependency theory. And I think probably was misunderstood or was ambiguous, not intentionally, but because of the condition, what was going on in Latin America in the 60s. And the ambiguity is that dependency theory was taken as a kind of leftist proposal. And that's a kind of the ambiguity. And that the moment in which dependency theory was kind of saying, after Prebisch, of course, that the third world country cannot develop under kind of global existing economic condition because of dependency. That was the moment in which Singapore was taken off.
See, exactly. Yeah.
Right? So I think in Latin America was a lot of ambiguity also in relationship with the Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And a lot of people, and myself among them, thought that dependent theory was a kind of leftist breakthrough. After Lula, and so I don't know, I don't have documentation, but there are a lot of people have documentation about talking about how important was Cardoso advice,
definitely,
to Lula, right?
Economy of Liberation, right? The book Economy of Liberation, the Faleto and Cardoso, yeah.
So Lula began to do what the Singapore Prime Minister former Prime Minister. I don't remember this. It escaped my name.
I'll look it up. The transcription.
Quan Liu, but I am missing something in the middle. So that's what he was doing in Singapore. And I think that, and then he was a good advisor to Deng Xiaoping.
Mm-hmm.
When Deng Xiaoping decided to change direction. So Lee Kuan Yew. So Lee Kuan Yew was advising Deng Xiaoping. And so China took off. So I think that that is what dependency theory was at the end proposing, but was not clear, that you had to appropriate capitalism in order to get independence from capitalism.
Oh, okay.
And that is what the Tigers did, and this is what Lee Kuan Yew did, and that is what and this is de-Westernization. That's why I say that Brazil is a de-Westernizing country. Mm-hmm. Bolivia is a de-Western because they are appropriating capitalism. Mm-hmm. They are developing an indigenous middle class. Of course, then there are so second point is the tension that not just between Cusco or Mexico and the periphery, but at this moment between the indigenous middle class, the kind of bourgeois indigenous middle class, and the indigenous people who are fighting against, or the same in Bolivia. Bolivia and Brazil. I mean, 40 million people left out of poverty, that is fine, but then you have the growing gap between
rich and poor.
The elite, right. So that is why I start kind of thinking about the Westernization, and that's what the Westernization means, and I think that this is what Singapore first, China, and then the Tigers. The Tigers are following that kind of appropriation of capitalism, but we control it, not you. And that's why failed. Latin American modernization and development failed because they were kind of waiting to solve the problem with the IMF and the World Bank. And was Lula who kind of redirect the economy. And now we have Argentina, we have Bolivia, we have Ecuador, etc., following that.
And Rousseff has continued the Westernization path, right?
Right. That's, and I don't see other possibility now. I mean, from a state cannot do better at this point than the Westernization. It's see what happened with Cuba. Where Cuba is going to join the Westernization, that kind of economy. So what Iran is doing. So now Iran is being praised by economists from the right in the United States because they are going neoliberal. No, they are not going neoliberal. They are appropriating capitalists. They are kind of doing the same thing that Singapore and China and the Tigers, etc. But that doesn't mean that they will become ideologically neoliberal. So there is a pending question from before, because it was Islam. Islam, institutional Islam is universalist, like universal Christianity.
Yes.
But there are theology of liberation. So the same way, there are kind of progressive Islamists that are not universal. So that is where you start kind of establish alliances with projects and I mean, feminists, for example, that are kind of taking over, interpreting the Quran, meeting in the mosque, etc., etc. No? So that is you don't have to stop being Muslim. What you have to stop being is pretend that Muslim is good for everybody, or the Christianity is good for everybody, or Marxism is good for everybody, etc. So that's where pluriversality comes into the picture, and that's what we are. One of the things we are fighting for.
That makes sense. So now, correct me if I misinterpreted your writings and your interviews, but sometimes I feel that you, like in your last answer, right, that you tend to celebrate the Westernization. And my question is, do you see a possibility of negative consequences coming as well with, besides this economic liberation, negative consequences, for example, when you think of Russia today, where homophobia is rampant and it is pretty much almost illegal, and so one of the things that Western culture has tried to impose, perhaps in the wrong way, but there's a sort of liberation with feminism, with gay and lesbian rights and things like that. So do you see a potential negative consequences of the de-Westernization?
Oh, sure. De-Westernization is not the happy paradise. I am not celebrating de-Westernization. I am saying de-Westernization is happening. So think about that. Yes. Don't think like the Marxists that, oh, we are now all capitalists and we are all neoliberal. No. If you think that way, I think you miss many points. So, de-Westernization on the one hand is capitalist. So because it's capitalist, have the same kind of negative aspect that Western capitalism. So the deterioration of the environment, the exploitation of labor, social injustice, etc., etc. But what I am saying, and this is why people think I am celebrating the Westernization, what I am saying, I cannot admit that you critique China without critiquing United States and Europe. That today, for me, is inadmissible, because de-Westernization is, and there are injustice and there are violations of human rights, but there is violation of human. So listen what intellectuals over there have to say. So that's what I am not celebrating de-Westernization, because de-Westernization, when appropriate, capitalists have to appropriate a certain way of life. But at the same time, they have to struggle with something that is still over their head, right? So when Western capitalism or Western civilization formed itself, they didn't have Islam. They already kind of expelled Islam out. And they didn't have China, because China was not trying to encroach over Europe. China didn't care about Europe, because that was the land of the barbarian, according to the
Middle Kingdom.
So what you have to understand on de-Westernization now is that the de-Westernization is still under certain control of Western. So they are responding to that at the same time they're trying to liberate. So liberation there is liberation of the state, not liberation of the nation. Liberation of the state doesn't mean liberation of the people.
Oh, okay.
That is crucial, right? And what we see now, the struggle with the Westernization, is that is what matters, because people don't count, even in the United States. You can first come the state, and then the people. To the point when people began to be attended even for political reasons, or to kind of trying to stop possible social turmoil. But de-Westernization and re-Westernization is a question of interstate relation.
Not between the people themselves.
Not between nations. That's why I say international relation is a misnomer. It's interstate relation, not international. Nation don't, or we relate, but we relate independently of the state to critique the state. Right? Now, on the other hand, I think that I don't celebrate de-Westernization, but I think it's very important, because what de-Westernization is doing is stopping a kind of global fascism. Because without de-Westernization, what we have is the implementation of neoliberal dream. Yeah. And what stops neoliberal dream is precisely de-Westernization. In 2011, 12, I was in a World Public Forum, not social forum, the public forum. That was created by Russia and China and India. They meet every year in Rhodes, and there are other meetings, but in Rhodes is every October, something like that. They invite about 600, 700 people, all paid. There are about 3 or 4 from Europe and United States. The rest are from the rest of the world. The year I went there, I was just had my panel one day, but then I stayed 3 other days and visit other panel. There was a common denominator. Everybody was against neoliberalism. We had to stop neoliberalism. And that's, so the World Public Forum is to de-Westernization. What the World Social Forum was kind of was to the left of, so the reconfiguration of the left, that there is another leg between Westernization, the re-Westernization, the coloniality, and the reconfiguration of the left. And the Social Forum was a very, and still is, a very important institution for that, for the reconfiguration of the left.
And there's no, so you said there were about 3 people from Europe. There's no representation from leftists from the US at all?
Yeah, Fish.
Stanley Fish?
No, Stanley Fish, no, Fisk.
Ah, Fisk.
Fisk. The only one I remember, and then Akhil Belgami, but he's in India, he's a brilliant guy. He's in Columbia University, but he's from India, so he was with Ashish Nandi and all the people from India. So there were some European, but it was like the proportion of this Shanghai Biennale, were just a minimum amount. I mean, people from the United States and Europe were there.
I was asking you because you always mentioned that we have to keep in mind that coloniality not only happens in the third world, that you have coloniality within Europe and within the US, the Chicanos, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, you know, those are sort of US colonies, and there is coloniality being suffered by people in the United States and in Europe, right?
Well, yeah, but what we have to do there is to kind of distinguish different articulation of coloniality, because coloniality is a connector. It's a connector between different, it's articulated different ways. So I think in the case of the Latinos and in the case of Europe, what the proper term there is
internal colonialism.
Internal colonialism, exactly. So internal colonialism was a kind of re-articulation of coloniality. So now with the native or the Latin American Creole, we do the same that the Cachupines were doing. So they, I mean, but that's happened in Africa too. So they kicked the French and the British, and then the native did kind of internal colonialism. So internal colonialism is that concept that gives you another dimension of how coloniality. So that's what we are saying. Coloniality is not over; it's all over.
It's all over, not over. I like that.
Coloniality is over. Coloniality is all over, while the concept of development and modernity continue to be all over. So China, for example, and the Tiger and Singapore, they don't question development. And so that, no, they need development because that's the way they appropriate capitalism, and that kind of economic affirmation allows them to have kind of political independence. And that's what China and Russia is doing. And then, yes, of course, I mean, there are different configurations. In the case of Russia now, Russia is not just economically strong, but also Putin brought the Orthodox Church into the state, like Constantine. And, well, so you have this kind of homophobia and all this kind of social...
And also there's a very interesting historical connection there, because at the same time that Islam was always perceived as the enemy of Europe, right? The Orthodox Christians were for a time also a big potential enemy for Western Europe, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So this historical, it has not
well,
ended.
that is the line that Huntington traced with the class of civilization. That was just that line that goes through Ukraine. I don't remember how Ukraine was there, but yeah. So that kind of separation of the Catholic and Protestant and the Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
So the Greek church and the Roman version, totally
It
different.
survived.
Yeah.
So let me change topics now. I mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to talk about terms that you use, right?
Yeah.
And one that is very interesting and a little perhaps polemical or misunderstood is the one of geopolitics of knowledge that you often use, and I've seen in conversations with colleagues or conferences how some people either don't understand or don't agree with it. For example, it's been brought up that isn't there a danger of confusing the epistemological position of a person with perhaps their social or geographic position? For example, you can be an indigenous person in Bolivia and be emulating Eurocentric perceptions or be an elite indigenous person in Bolivia. So how do you separate this geopolitical of knowledge with what you mention always, right? That we have to change the locus of enunciation. But locus is a place, but I think your explanation usually is that one thing is where you live and another thing is where you dwell, right? You can live in the United States and have the perspective of South America, for example, right?
Right. I made that argument a long time ago in '91, a couple of places, but one was, I had to retrieve that article, was the kind of the geopolitics of cultural location or something like that. Right? That was the geopolitics of knowledge. But the geopolitics of knowledge was first introduced to counter the idea that that knowledge is universal and it's not location. That Immanuel Kant or Karl Marx don't have location. They say what they say because there is a kind of universal, disembodied kind of knowledge. So the geopolitics of location, in that sense, is it's not just me who is located; it's Kant who is located. So let's talk about Kant. Let's talk about Kant, geopolitics of knowledge. That is not, again, a kind of universal proposal. Kant is German, and he's living a certain time, and this is a project that is not determined by the land of Germany, but by the location of Germany in the world order. So it's not by chance that after Kant comes Hegel, and so he tells the story of the spirit that happened long time ago in a distant space, and now come to Germany of the present, who is the center of Europe and the center of the world. That is geopolitics of knowledge. Right? So the second point is certainly because of Westernization is all over, Westernization couldn't be expanded in such a way without collaboration. Collaboration, and I use
from whom?
Huh?
Collaboration from whom?
Collaboration from the local, from the local in Bolivia, from the local in Argentina, from the local in Tanzania, etc. So from the local in China. So not every Chinese is kind of socialist Confucianist. There is a lot of people in China who would like to become Western, and they're kind of defending Westernization. But that is part of the geopolitics of location. If you are a Westernizer in China, you are Westernizer because you're in China, and China now is not going Westernizer, so you have to defend that position. So what the geopolitics of knowledge is saying is that every knowledge is not just located, but it's located within the colonial metric of power. And that location of colonial metric of power kind of intersect the knower through how the knower was classified racial and gender sexually. You can block that. And I said, no, knowledge doesn't have anything to do with my body. And you become a collaborator of Western European epistemology. Or you can say, well, no, I mean, I would produce knowledge, but I would start producing knowledge because I feel uncomfortable, I am angry, and I feel a lot of people that are angry for the same reason, for economic reason, for racial reason, for gender, sexuality, classification, etc., etc. So that in general. But the third point is that geopolitical knowledge was followed up by body political knowledge. And the kind of social condition that provoke or prompt them to come out was in the third world. I mean, again, we go to philosophy of liberation. Dussel in philosophy of liberation said it's not the same to be born in New York than to born in Chiapas. That was in the 70s, right? So he was saying that as a kind of what kind of knowledge we produce in the third world and why. So we are not, you can be collaborator and you can have a Kantian institute in Buenos Aires to help the German to propagate the ideas of Kant or Marx or whatever. And you can say, well, no, that is, I don't feel like that. And so you become Rodolfo Kusch, who knows German philosophy, but he goes to think from Aymara indigenous and from there to kind of dialogue, confrontation with Heidegger, Nietzsche, Husserl, Hegel, etc. So that is a kind of third world location. But with the civil rights movement, I think that the body politics came. And that is where, we were talking at the beginning, that all this new disciplinary configuration emerged. Women's studies, gender studies, Afro-American, what is that? That's a kind of body politics of people who do not want to be any longer controlled by, you can call the biopolitic of knowledge, right? And if you take Fanon, in Fanon you find both. You find the black intellectual of the third world. So you have the geo and body politics. So the last point I want to make is another criticism that people say here, but they say, you know, an indigenous project doesn't represent all the indigenous. I say, no, a white project doesn't represent every white. But why you don't see that, but you see it on the indigenous? What I say, what you cannot negate is the project of CONAMAC is an indigenous project, even if that doesn't represent every indigenous, and even if there is a lot of mestizos joining that project. And that is what I call identity in politics, not identity politics. Identity in politics is that you know that there is not an essential kind of force, but it's a kind of historical, political location of your epistemic and political project. So that's identity in politics. So Fausto Reinaga said, I am not Indian, goddammit.
I'm not peasant, goddammit. I'm Indian. That's what he said, right?
No, I am
no soy campesino, soy indio, no?
No, well, the version I have is, I am not Indian, goddammit. I am Aymara. But you made me Indian.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah, because peasant is, he rejected peasant because peasant was a class Marxist classification. But you made me Indian. I am Aymara. Now
you're homogenizing all
right, exactly. People. Now, as Indian, I will fight. But that doesn't mean that I assume that that's identity in politics. So that's your political knowledge, body political knowledge.
And so what would be the difference between geopolitics of knowledge and situated knowledge?
Situated knowledge is a very specific version of white American feminism. And geopolitical knowledge comes from the, comes from the history of, or articulation of coloniality. Okay. So there are two different projects, and they can converse, although there are difficulties, there are conversation in that conversation, because Maria Lugones, who is a kind of woman of color, is kind of confronted with the kind of located knowledge of white feminism. But I think that what is common on this kind of diversity is that people began to understand that knowledge is not universal. Yes. So the way that white American feminists, US feminists, brought that into the conversation was situated knowledge. But we were talking about this, I mean, geopolitical knowledge because of Dussel. We were talking much before that. It's not that we have priority with that before that. It has said this is autonomous. Yes. I mean, we don't talk about that because Dana Haraway, and Dana Haraway didn't talk because we were talking. Dana Haraway talked about that because she realized that women epistemology cannot depend on white male epistemology. And so she was doing the same kind of things in a specific sphere of struggle.
So then the follow-up is a personal question, so if you don't want to answer, you don't have to. But I have the curiosity. So I read one interview, I think a Chinese former student of yours asked you this question, and you mentioned that, yes, I was born in Argentina from Italian immigrants, but I did migrate, move to Paris to study in Europe, and I felt what it was being racialized as a Sudaca, right? And then later on I moved to the United States, and I saw what it was being racialized as a Latino or a Hispanic or whatever you want to call it. So my question is, if you had chosen to stay in Argentina, your thought, your writings would have been entirely different then.
Well, yeah, that's, if Eskimo were in the equator, there won't be. Absolutely, because I tell you, no, I have no problem there. I can tell you that it's very clear to me. The unconscious may say something else, but consciously, I went to France because I want to be part of universal knowledge. I want to be
an elite institution too.
Yeah, I'd be like if I want to go there and be like European. And then, so I went to study semiotics, of course. I was kind of reading all these things, and we knew about Fanon, we knew about dependency theory, but for me, we discussed Marx and all of that, but France and structuralism and post-structuralism, that was the kind of the attraction. And then you get there and say, and then you come here. But when I came here, with that experience of the Sudaca, and it was with the Latinos, the hyphen. At that moment, people were talking about a life in the hyphen.
Living in the hyphen. Living in the hyphen.
Living in the hyphens, yeah, Pérez Firmat.
Gustavo.
So I realized I was Italo-Argentinian. So I realized that I was living in the hyphen. So, and that was a tremendous shift. And there was other kind of interference there, that I was kind of studying teaching Latin American colonial literature. And reading Garcilaso La Vega. I said, there's another guy in the hyphen here, right?
Very much so, yeah. Mestizo. He was and he was not, right? Because sometimes he calls himself Indian, then he calls himself Mestizo, and he's proud of it. So he didn't have it very clear what he was, Mestizo or Indian, right?
No, right, but he had to negotiate the kind of the culture of the mother, the history of the Incas, and being in Spain and writing like a...
Being the product of rape.
Right, yeah. And then I kind of went to Guaman Pomerayel and was in a different condition, another guy in the hyphen, because he was addressing the Nueva Crónica to Philip III. So, and he was kind of interacting already with the missionaries, with Avila and all these kind of people. So, that was a big transformation, and that was a transformation in the emotion, in the feelings, in the affect. So, as Iris Zavala told me once, when I began to write about these kind of things, and we used to meet in semiotics because she's doing discourse analysis and all that, and one day she told me in one of the Congress, we said, Walter, I like what you were writing before, but I like much better what you write now. I said, why? Because you are writing with anger. And that's it. I said, the big transformation was when I realized, and I don't know if in Argentina probably how long would have taken me to realize this, or even if, well, probably now, yes, because all these kind of ideas are circulating widely in Latin America and Argentina, but would have taken me a lot of time.
So in a way, you sort of followed in the steps of Julio Cortázar, right? That in this great discussion he had with Arguedas, he said that he had come to know Argentina from Paris. It was that same experience from you, or?
Well, right. I mean, it's yeah. I think it's very similar because of the stay, right? And I think that Dussel has a similar kind of realization when he went to Spain, and he began to realize it was not Sudaca at that time, but I mean that he was South American. I think he said, and then we went to France, and then we went to Germany, and the northern I moved, the southern, the southerner I was.
Yes.
So, but he went back, right? But he realized that in that. So I think that Borges realized that too in Switzerland. I mean, because I mean, what Borges does, I mean, is, I won't dare to say decolonial, but one of my students said, yes, Borges is decolonial.
Borges, of all people. I would
right,
have,
I mean,
never thought of Borges as decolonial.
No, right. I mean, that's what I say. I'm not there to say that, but a student of mine said
his love for England is not an English culture.
No, but I think he had a point because he was kind of reading Joyce, Borges, and Cortázar as kind of from a decolonial perspective, kind of. And I mean, the last analysis. Borges is a tremendous critique to Western epistemology. Yeah? And that is, how is that, and why Foucault kind of, look what this guy is saying, right?
And when he talks about his essay on the Latin American writer, right? How we have the right to be Latin American, right? That is, I think about it, Borges.
Oh, yeah.
It is a sort of decolonial.
No, I think it's, I mean, not that he thought himself decolonial, but there is a lot of things he did and articulated that are very compatible.
That's true, yeah.
With, and Joyce too. I mean, and look at that, Irish. Oh, yeah. And you start thinking about Beckett. I'm rereading Beckett now. And Camus. So you see, Derrida kind of really went straight into assimilation. But Camus, no. Camus, there is always that kind of tension between being Algerian and...
Pied Noir, no?
Pied Noir, yeah. So that's the kind of a personal story.
But did Camus had an empathy with third world struggles, or do you think he really saw it from the south? From
yeah, exactly. I think he got this. Yeah, I think he had this tension with kind of European French French culture. Let's put it that way. No.
Same with Sartre, right?
Sartre.
Jean-Paul Sartre had the same view, or don't you think?
I think what I really admire in Jean-Paul Sartre is, for example, the prologue he wrote to the Wretched of the Earth.
Yeah. He has more anger than Fanon.
But you see, this is an anger of a European with their fellow European.
Yes.
And that is.
But don't you think it's ironic that he does say in that prologue, and he doesn't need a European to validate this, but you are validating it. I mean, he does say in the prologue, this book doesn't need me to validate it as a white European, but you are validating it. I mean,
yeah. No, right. You can always do this kind of deconstruction, the reading.
Yeah.
But I think that he needed to validate in order to say that it's not needed to validate. Because if he doesn't say it, and he doesn't say it in the prologue, people won't pay attention. I think that to say that to validate the book in order to say this book doesn't need to validate, even if the book kind of, well, then took over by itself. But at that time, I think, I think Sartre at that very moment, was kind of into this. I always gave my student the Wretched and Sartre, because, well, probably happened to you too. I mean, a lot of people say, well, I am white, male, Jew sometimes. How can I be decolonial? What can I do? I said, I don't know if you have to be decolonial or not, but the question is how you think about this issue.
Linda Alcoff has the article to answer that question, right? Linda Alcoff has
Well,
an
right.
article answering that question.
Yeah,
So,
right. Yeah. So exactly, because it's said, well, you don't have to become a black, or you don't have to become an Indian, or you have to become a third world, but you are located in the colonial metro power. So think about your location, and that is, and you cannot change those things, but you cannot not be aware of that.
And earlier when we were talking about El Inca Garcilaso, you mentioned Guamán Poma, and I've noticed when you and other decolonial thinkers mention this sort of predecessors, right? Predecessors. You always mention Guamán Poma, Mariátegui, MSSR, Franz Fanon, and then Roberta Menchú and Saldúa. But I've noticed that Guamán Poma would be the earliest you can go to, right? From a decolonial perspective, he would be the first one with a decolonial view.
For what we know, but I mean, if there is another one, would be that from that time,
that area,
cannot that area or Mexico, and from that time cannot be the 15th century, and that is very important for the following reason. I mean, that I didn't.
Couldn't he be a Muslim in Granada during the last phase of the Reconquest?
What is that?
When they're being expelled from Granada? It wouldn't be a similar situation where you have encomiendas as well. You have.
There is a book written by a Moro, and I was in the committee. I was really surprised because there is, and not only that there is, but the student also made the kind of connection with Guamán Poma. So there is a Morisco who is a sort of Guamán Poma
Of the peninsula.
Of the peninsula. I don't remember but I have the book at home.
Yes, if you think about it, so the Spanish conquest of South America is a continuation of the Reconquest.
Absolutely. So
the concept is pretty much the same.
Right. But what is important there is that the articulation of modernity, coloniality, and decoloniality are three words in one complex concept. See, because Guamán Poma is a decolonial response to modernity, coloniality. And that book, I don't remember, is kind of a response from the other end, from the kind of the imperial. Why not imperial? I have to think more about that. But it's very equivalent. And this student, she studied the Morisco, but have a chapter kind of related with Guamán Poma. Thank you for reminding me that.
The next question I have, I already know your answer because you gave it to me yesterday. But I like the answer, and I want to ask you a question to incorporate it in this interview so I can transcribe it later. But I think the question I asked you after your talk yesterday, you mentioned that we were talking about how postcolonial studies locates the beginning of modernity in the 18th century and in the Enlightenment, whereas most Hispanic thinkers, and especially the colonial thinkers, located in 1492 with the arrival of Columbus to America. And you mentioned that is the beginning of racism. And my question was, well...
As we understood it today.
As we understand it today. And I asked you, well, so you have mentioned earlier that in order to colonize or enslave someone, you have to inferiorize it, dehumanize it, animalize it. And I mentioned, for example, in the 7th century when the Arabs leave the Arabian Peninsula and conquer all North Africa, and they take millions of slaves. Many of them are Europeans, right? Kidnapped from their coasts or from their ships, and they ask for ransom and all that. So wouldn't that also be a sort of racism, right? If they even talk about them having menus with different tone color for their skin, and they would have different prices and stuff. I know your answer, but can you give it again?
Right. No, what I said because that question goes together sometimes with others. I say, well, but Roman were imperial, and Incas were imperial, and Aztec were imperial. And I said, well, yeah, they were imperial, but they were not capitalist. So there were different kind of political economic configuration. So in the case of race, what I said yesterday, I would like to repeat with just adding perhaps, and not adding, but kind of emphasizing something that yesterday I just said in passing, is that races that we needed, as we know it today, have two crucial moments in the 16th century. One is religious, and it's kind of the expulsion. I mean, we have Christianity, and then they have the bad guys, the wrong religion, the Jews and the Moors. So, and that's what kind of Covarrubias will talk about the concept of raza. He said this is de los caballos, the pura raza, etc., the horses, and then it's also said of Jews and Moors. So that's a kind of one leg. And when Spain came to America, they have to deal with indigenous people, and they have no religion. But they have to deal with the African too, and they have no religion, according, of course, to the European. So what did they do? So they invented Indian and black, and then the mestizos and mulattoes and sambos, right?
And many more.
And then after that, many more, 16, etc., etc. But the difference there is that of all this kind of civilization, you call it like that, before 1500, well, the Chinese also make that kind of distinction. Those who live in the center and then who lives farther from the center, and the Aztec did the same, and the Inca did the same, and the Greeks did the same, right? The question is that this classification was not related to capitalism. So the races as we know it today is a kind of classification of certain kind of people in order to expropriate land, to exploitation of labor, to make people commodities, like slaves, that were a commodity. And and this is what I want to add today that I kind of didn't yet. The most radical difference with previous classification, and a radical difference that is related to capitalism, is that for the first time in the history of human civilizations, human life are dispensable, because none of the previous civilization made inferior people dispensable. Not even the Greeks. They were. What does it mean, dispensable? Dispensable is a commodity. So when you use it, you throw it away, and you bring another one. So dispensability of human life is the kind of the basic consequence of racism from there to today. And this is connected to the question of the nation state that somebody asked, and then I was thinking about that. One of the pernicious consequences of the nation state is the state care for the national. The rest are not people. They are not human beings. The rest are dispensable life. So that kind of, when you start talking about that, you see how the dispensable life that is linked to races and the historical foundation of capitalism, on the one hand, and then the emergence of the state, and the emergence of the state that makes non-national dispensable life brought fascism. And that is what Anna Arendt and Agamben call naked life or bare life.
Bare life. Yeah.
So you have these two kind of parallel histories that kind of economy and the state make one commodities and one dispensable life. One dispensable life, the other bare life, but that's also dispensable because they are not national. We eliminate them.
So in a way, the Shoah, the Nazi Holocaust, and all the Jews and other non-Jews killed are the ultimate consequence of the creation of the nation state taken to the end.
That's my view.
That's a very good.
That's my view.
Yeah, very original. I had never thought about that.
I have a couple of articles about that.
Send me the link and we put it in the interview.
No, right. But also kind of link with, connect. We have a summer school in the Middleburg. We started in 2010, and we are in the sixth edition. The first 2 or 3 editions, the theme was coloniality, slavery, and the Holocaust. And the purpose was to the student understand that this, because slavery is something of the Atlantic and the Americas, and Holocaust is something of Europe. No. So when you think from the colonial metric of power, and you think they're connected, they're part of this machine.
So the Holocaust is applying, the same thing that Belgians did to people in the Congo, now Europeans are doing it to other Europeans.
That was Césaire saw it in 1955, when he said in the Discourse Colonialist, something like, what European cannot stand is not the killing, is the fact that they kill white men with the same technique they apply to the people of color. That is what the bourgeois is difficult to swallow, to kind of process.
And that is why a genocide in the Balkans is stopped at the beginning, and in Rwanda is left, right, till it ends, and because it's not the same, it's not perceived as equally important.
Right. Yeah. No, and the German is what you say. I mean, Namibia was the kind of the experiment of what happened with Hitler, with Nazis.
Namibia?
Yeah, the German in Namibia were really.
Oh yeah, they eliminated a whole
genocide.
group, yeah.
The genocide of the
that ethnic group.
I think Césaire doesn't mention specific Namibia, but probably he was thinking.
I forget the name of the ethnic group, but they wiped it out, right?
Oh, the Herreros.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Okay, so
Araro, Herrero, something like that.
Changing the topic. So when I read this, I thought it was a little bit polemical, but I know you're okay with it because you gave me the article to read. It's in the article by Linda Alcoff.
Yeah.
So in one of the footnotes, endnotes by her, she mentions an article by Scott Michelson and Scott Cutler Show, Rethinking Border Thinking, and she mentions that they accuse you, and I quote, of erecting a new metaphysically essentialist binary between Europe and its colonies, and of romanticizing American cultures. And so...
do you read the article by
them? No. No.
I think it's, when you read the article, it's a defense of Derridianism. It's a defense of Derrida and Derridianism. Because they go into my critique of, not my critique, I mean, I don't have radical critique, but kind of distancing from Derrida. So the article sounds like a defense of their own Derridianism. And the first sentence of the article is something like that. So for betters of words, Mignolo's local history, global design have a sizable influence. When I read that sentence, I said, well, let's see from where the guns, the bullets are coming. No? But anyway, that's the kind of introduction. I think that they kind of, I don't know, misunderstood. They didn't want to understand, because it seems to me that they are, in what they say there, they're kind of running a kind of something that people say without much reflection. That number one, two things here. Number one, that I polarize or romanticize the indigenous. I don't polarize because I always talk about entanglement. There is no European and indigenous, the European and indigenous. So indigenous are brought into the European. And second is that, that really is interesting for me, that they, and in certain cases Zizek also, when they say these kind of things, they don't realize that they are romanticizing the Enlightenment and they are romanticizing
exactly.
Greece.
You can tell them the same thing, right?
Well, right. So they are romanticizing Greece.
That's why they don't like identity politics and all this kind of thing, right?
I don't like identity politics either. That's why I talk about identity in politics. I mean, I understand identity. I understand why people needed to go into identity politics. So that is not the way I will go, but I understand this. But the way to kind of support that and at the same time not be linked to that is identity in politics. So yeah, no, that was That's a kind of postmodern argument against the colonial argument. That's part of the debate. So that's.
It doesn't make you that uncomfortable.
Huh?
It doesn't make you that uncomfortable then.
Oh no.
You're used to it.
Oh no, absolutely. No, I mean, right. I mean, when you put something there in the public sphere, well, you have to kind of.
So going back to the terms that you use, another term that I've read a lot in your writings is, and you mentioned it earlier, the body politics of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And let me see if I understand it correctly. But I think what you mean by body politics of knowledge is the resistance that the population have against biopower, right? Or the what Foucault called biopolitics, right?
Yeah.
So if this is it, would you consider, for example, the Indignados movement, the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, would this be examples of body politics of knowledge? Or?
I link more body politic knowledge to project, to what I call the kind of the global political society. And I said yesterday, I see the Indignados and all this kind of uprising as a politicization of the civil society. You can, but the question, the question is that the body politics are arguments built around the control of the bodies that don't want to be controlled. Mm-hmm. While the uprising, I mean the manifestation of the Indignados and all that, are kind of collective manifestation against the abuses of the state. Any kind of abuse, it would be in Ukraine, would be
the physical.
Not necessarily it's not the racial and sexual thing that is more kind of the social loss of privilege that brings of people loss of privilege, but also kind of realization, corruption and the abuse of the state, that the state is not really working for the nation. So I call the politicization of the civil society. I will put that in a different kind of channel. Yeah.
So we're running out of time. I just have two last questions. Is that okay?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You still have energy?
Yeah.
We have a whole workshop after this.
Right. Maybe I have energy and water.
Maybe we should put this after the workshop. Right. Now you're going to be too tired. But so this is a question that I myself have. I've read Mariátegui, and I like Mariátegui very much, but I don't necessarily see the connection that you always make of him as a decolonial writer, and I would like you to open my eyes.
Yeah, right. Well, first of all, that Mariátegui is a fundamental thinker for Quijano. You cannot understand Quijano without Mariátegui. Not he's just talk, but also he kind of wrote a lengthy introduction to the collective work of Mariátegui, published by Biblioteca Ayacucho. So the idea of coloniality owes as much to dependency theory as to Mariátegui, because dependency theory was not seeing colonialism. Mariátegui is seeing colonialism, is seeing racism, is seeing the question of the land. I mean, all these kind of things that we are talking about, the expropriation of land, the exploitation of labor. So Mariátegui saw that dependency theory was more Chile, Argentina, Brazil. That was not the question. But Quijano was in both. Mm-hmm. He was in the debate with dependency theory, and he is a Peruvian, very much into the kind of the legacies of Mariátegui. So that is very, very crucial there. Second, I mean, yeah, Mariátegui saw this kind of the question of race and the question of the land. The question of the Indian question is the question of the land. So Mariátegui brought in a very creative way the kind of the Marxist with the kind of the local history of colonialism, and that's what Marxists never understood, and that's why kind of.
So that's where I have the problem, because so isn't that exactly the Marxist, the vulgar Marxism or Marxist economic reductionism that you were talking about yesterday? How you cannot reduce the Indian problem to the land or the economy, because knowledge is very important, right? The control of knowledge was in the hands of the criollos. So wouldn't that separate Mariátegui from the decolonial project?
I understand very well the question, but it's not orthodox Marxist, because the question of India and the question of the land is racist, is
It's
rasa.
race more than...
Right, and that is what Mariátegui saw, and that is what
I
Marxists didn't understand. He was talking about race, it's class. What's he talking about? And that is why Quijano put race at the center of his first article on coloniality. That's the kind of connection with.
That's definitely not in Marx and Engels, who supported the invasion of Mexico by the United States, the invasion of Algeria by France.
No, absolutely. And that's why Mariátegui was not accepted by the Marxists, especially. But the question of racism between Indian and land, and that is totally out of Marxism. And again, Quijano made of race, and that is the point where Quijano began to break with Marxism. Because the concept of race. And the other thing that I would like to add, but you didn't ask, but I will add it, is I just wrote an article on Mariátegui and Gramsci.
I'll put the link in
so that's, I mean, it's not to choose one or the other, but it's just to go against certain Gramscian, even Latin American Gramscian, that when they compare, they put Gramsci and Mariátegui. They put Mariátegui and Gramsci. So what I was trying to sort out is the kind of the political, ideological articulation of Gramsci in the Southern question and that local history, and Mariátegui local history of colonialism in specific colonialism in the Andes, that then Quijano kind of put it at another level, more abstract kind of coloniality, not just Peruvian colonialism, but this is part of a larger picture. And again, it's not the question to choose, but and that's why geopolitical knowledge is important, and body political knowledge too. Because one thing is to be in Italian concerned with the Southern question, and the other one is a mestizo in Peru concerned with the racism and the land and the Indians. The smells different.
Yeah, the reason why I'm interested in Mariátegui is, remember I told you yesterday that I had used some of your theories in the last book I published on the Chinese Peruvian.
Yeah, you told me.
So one.
Give me that one, and then you send me the other.
I'll give you that one. Yes. So the first major Sino-Peruvian author is Pedro Sulen. And I would like to do more research on the influence of Pedro Sulen in Mariátegui, because I understand that my colleague Juan de Castro, a Peruvian, has told me that he's writing a book on Mariátegui, and he told me that when he was younger, he was quite reactionary and conservative. And
Mariátegui?
Yes, and perhaps it was this Chinese Peruvian, right, who opened his eyes to the indigenous question and the indigenous problems. And Mariátegui, when Pedro Sulen died, he wrote an article. Yeah. He wrote an article on how they would both go to these indigenous conferences, and they were the only non-Indian people there. And I think I am convinced that Pedro Sulen is the one who opened his eyes to the indigenous question. So I'm trying to do more research.
That is very interesting.
Yes.
Let me know what you find out.
Well. Yeah. So the last question, the most important of all the questions I've asked you. What do you think of UC Merced and the students and the professors you've met?
I have little base for judgment, but for the day and a half that I found I've been here, I mean, I have a great time. I mean, I have a great time with faculty. I have a great time yesterday and after the talk and during the reception, and I hope to have a better time now. But also, basically, what I'm really pleased is to find the collective, energetic group of faculty, intellectual, and graduate students and undergraduate. I don't know about undergraduate students because I don't think I have contact with them, but some graduate students, the kind of creative energy that is great. So keep it up.
You're coming back to visit us then?
Absolutely. I know my way now.
Thank you so much for your interview and your time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, guys.